So yes, that's me. I'm a partner at Container Solutions. I was originally an engineer. I spent 15 years in online gambling, working on back-end systems. And then I got into containers and Docker and Kubernetes, and I became an OpenShift architect at Barclays for 3.5 years. Then I worked at State Street for a year as a cloud-native architect. And then I joined Container Solutions as an engineer. I wanted to get back to engineering, but I ended up being quite commercial and interested in giving talks and doing pre-sales and so on, so I became a partner. So I do a bit of everything. So I mentioned who we are. We basically have two arms. One arm is this sort of strategy thing. We've written a book on cloud native transformation, with O'Reilly, which talks about the different patterns that happen during cloud native transformations, so you can adopt standard ways of dealing with the challenges that come from doing cloud native. But we're also an engineering shop, so people come to us if they want to accelerate their cloud native journey and transfer skills quickly. So we wrote, if you've used Kubernetes, you may have heard of external secrets operator, which is a thing that collects secrets from third-party resources. We built half of that. GoDaddy built the other half. It was two separate projects. We merged into one, and now it's the one and only external secrets operator. We also wrote the Java operator SDK for Kubernetes, which then got picked up by Red Hat. So we have a track record of writing open source stuff and then kind of just giving it away. We're not a product company, so we don't know how to turn this into money. We just do it really to get conversations going with potential clients. And also because our engineers need something to do. So just in one slide, what I'm trying to do today, talked about bringing continuous integration, DevOps, cloud native, whatever you want to call it, but that concept of shifting left to compliance and controls. It's an area that's traditionally been underrepresented, I think because nobody in compliance, sorry, not nobody, I've got to be careful what I say, there are people in the room. Traditionally, compliance and audit folk have not been technically minded. And technical folk have not been audit minded. So there's just been no real cross-pollination between the two. And so yeah, so we're interested in actually bridging that gap. And we can't do it alone. And that's why we're asking for help. It's critical for this. There are tools out there which are proprietary, which you can pay for, that sort of do some of this. As far as we know, they're either closed source, or you can't contribute to it, or they don't use sort of standards like OSCAL. So who here is familiar with OSCAL? Not many. Okay, so I'll go into OSCAL in a bit. But also, yeah, so it's not, they're generally not compliant with open standards. As I say, it's an open source project. We're looking for help. This is also a work in progress. So we have a proof of concept which we're talking to various banks about. One bank we're in an NDA with, and they're going to probably hire us to write some plugins for this tool. And we're also talking to a couple of companies who have a product where they're doing a similar thing to this, but it's taking up their engineering time. They just want to use something off the shelf. So, we did this already. I know who you all are. Did anyone not put their hand up for any of these three? What are you doing here then?
Manager stroke lead.
Sorry?
Manager stroke lead.
Oh, you're okay. Oh no, sorry. There's a chap there who put his.
I own a company that does data security and privacy.
Ah, okay, right. So definitely you should be interested in this. Okay, so we've talked about how we got there. How do we move away from Confluence pages for control tracking? It's a nightmare. It's a pattern we've seen everywhere. Commercial changes led to the project being deprioritized. We didn't want to drop the idea. So we went and talked to a few people outside that bank, and they all said, yeah, I'd love a tool like that. This is great. So I probably don't need to go on about these challenges, but we all know that many of these Things are managed through Confluence, Word docs, spreadsheets. It's not in one place. So that's the problem. It's not maintained. So you go back and look at a page, and then you have to go and figure out, okay, this control, we were complying 6 months ago. Are we still complying? What's changed in the implementation? We have to go and check again. There's no metrics. There's no reporting. And there's no common language, typically, to describe these things. There are sort of common languages around controls, sort of standards, and then there's the CCC, which is obviously part of FINOS and is growing. So there's moves towards it, but it's each business we've worked with has tend to have its own sort of flavour of the language around it. And in terms of the broader context, since 2008, the regulators have been very concerned with fiscal compliance. So they don't want to see the banks run out of money again like they did in 2008. Now that has, hopefully after 16 years, been somewhat alleviated, they're looking at more about operational risk. And so you're seeing things like DORA and the Financial Services and Markets Act. These things are starting to put focus on the financial sector operators to get their act together with compliance. And if you look at DORA, as a compliance officer, it's potentially quite scary what it's saying, because it's very wide, it's very general. These regulations tend to be very wide, very general. When the rubber hits the road, we don't quite know what it's going to look like. It's probably going to be less scary than that. But various compliance officers we've spoken to have said, yeah, I'm a bit worried about how I'm going to face some of these challenges if they come in on the high side in the next couple of years. So, continuous compliance as code. We want to be able to prove that controls are in place and have been in place and continue to be in place. We want, as a compliance manager, I want to know what state is what risks do I have, what controls are out of compliance, what systems are problematic, which teams should I be worried about, that kind of thing. And ideally, anyone should be able to print off a report for the auditor when they turn up and say, like, look, here's the evidence that we've done this, we've done that. We're following the right protocols. So OSCAL is the Open Security Controls Assessment Language. I always forget that. Essentially, OSCAL is a NIST standard that describes and defines a schema for talking about control catalogs, assessment plans, system security plans, etc., etc. It's still, I think, fair to say, in the relatively early stages, and by that I mean it's only a few years old. But we saw it as a really useful way into this project, because we could have defined our own schema based on what we thought was important, but it's an open standard, it's an open schema. It might be slightly over-engineered for what we need now, but it's sort of future-proof because more and more companies are getting on board with it. It's forming a significant part of the Common Cloud Controls project, or it's certainly its creators are heavily involved with it. And from a technical point of view, we wanted it to be open as well. So there is an open architecture to this product, which allows you to plug in your own systems to it. I'll talk a bit more about that later. So, in fact, I'll talk about this now. So this is, at the moment, the current implementation of compliance framework. And essentially, there is a configuration API, which is written in Go. And that configuration API allows you to submit plans to the system, create activities. These are all sort of technical OSCAL terms, catalogs, and so on. And they get stored in a configuration database. So it's MongoDB. OSCAL is JSON, so MongoDB seemed a natural fit. we can just essentially plug in the JSON schemas to the system. Then, once you create an assessment plan, that plan goes to the event bus, and anything you like can be plugged into that bus. So we use NATs for that bus. It's just, yeah, it's a standard sort of lightweight event bus. And one thing we've written off that is the so-called assessment runtime. So the assessment runtime is the system which runs and collects plans and then creates a schedule to run these continuous compliance checks on. So if you think of it like, I suppose you could think of it like a sort of continuous configuration manager. So something like Chef or something like that. You just feed it things to run. For each type of thing you want to check, there will be a plugin. So again, it's an open architecture. This thing is quite simple in the middle, and you just pull down a plugin if you want to check something. So the two examples we'll see today are a plugin to run an SSH command and tell you if it's true or false, if it returns true or false on a remote server. And another one that checks all your running VMs on a cloud platform to determine whether they have a data classification tag. Okay, so those are the two examples we'll see today. But you could essentially write whatever plugins you like. Requires only two functions to be implemented, and then you can just submit it to the plugin store. And then the assessment runtime goes off, checks the resources, sends the results back to the event bus. The configuration API picks up the results and stores it in MongoDB. And then you've got a persistent store of the history of your compliance state. That's the idea. When we've talked to a couple of banks, they're quite interested in plugging things into the event bus. Like one bank mentioned that they would like to check all their VMs to determine whether they have some piece of software installed in their VMs, and if they haven't, automatically pick up that message from the event bus and then go to the code base, update the code base for the configuration management for that VM, and then submit the change to that team to fix. So this particular bank has a challenge around their engineers claim they spend half their time dealing with toil around compliance. So we're running an old version of Linux. We need to go and update that. That's taking us so much time to do. And they have no picture of where they are at a high level with all these different challenges. So senior manager comes along and says, I hear Linux is out of date on 10%, a bunch of our machines. How many machines? How long is it taking to fix? How many are left to do? How long does it take to fix each one? These are questions that they can't easily get answers to at the moment. But you can imagine other things like other reporting tools you'd want to link off it. I haven't mentioned the dashboard UI because we're back-end engineers. We're no good at doing front ends. We tried, didn't really do a good job. So again, that's an area where we'd like help. But for the moment, we've just got a command line front end, which I'll show in a minute. Okay, so let's get to the demo / walkthrough. So this is command line only. There will be some graphics, but it will be all in the terminal. And as I mentioned, we're going to have two assessment plans. One checking for tags, and one checking something around security on SSH. The VM tagging check will be for data classification tags on each VM, and the SSH security check is a check that there are no Postgres processes running under the user Postgres that are not databases. So what we're doing is we're checking that only databases are running under the user Postgres. No one's logged in as Postgres and is doing something scary. Okay, so let's go to the terminal. So I've got a system, I've got a setup running at the moment, and if I show plans, hopefully, maybe I'll make that bigger. You can see we've got two plans here in the system. One is the Azure VM Tag Assessment Plan, and one is the SSH Assessment Plan. So these are stored in two different sort of schemas. If I graph them, we can see now in real time we've got this view. Green is observations, which is an OSCAL term meaning item that we've seen. So it's non-judgmental. It's just we've checked something, we've looked at something. That's an observation. And a finding, which is, if you like, it's a negative observation. So there's a problem here, it needs to be fixed. So green, observations, one finding. So we've got two plans, and we've got three observations and one finding. So let's have a look. Let's pick a plan. So I'm going to pick the VM tag 1, and let's call that VM tag. Okay, so if we graph that, we can see that just for the VM tag check, we've got 2 observations per minute. This is per minute, by the way. 2 observations in the last minutes, and one finding. So if I want to see the detail of that, I can have a look at get all findings. So at the moment this is just JSON, but obviously you can someone could put a front end on this, but it's telling us the details. So description, the virtual machine, blah, 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 uncompliant one, does not have a data classification tag. Time of the check was that, and the title of the finding is missing data classification tag. And checks, it's a cron system, so it checks every minute. If you configure it to. You can configure it to check every day or whatever cron specification you want to give it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on to uncompliant one in Azure and set the data classification. Hopefully I spelled that right. Let's call that secret. Oops. Okay, so we need to wait a minute or so for the graph to catch up. But in the meantime, I can show you the interface for this. So this is the API we've got at the moment for Compliance Framework. Not all of these are implemented, but it should give you a flavor of what's going on. Most of our work has been around the plan section, but there's this catalog, so this control catalog concept where you can create controls and then get controls and put controls and so on, update controls. And with plan, we've got the ability to create plans, activate. We get compliance over time, which is what the graph shows. Compliance status by targets. So a target is one of the is the sort of the subject of your compliance check. I'll go into that a bit more in a minute. But essentially, yeah, this is the API for the service. Now, if we go, oh yes, sorry, I should talk a little bit about the language. So OSCAL is, yeah, it's a NIST framework. And for example here, it's divided into layers. So you've got assessment layer, you've got implementation layer, you've got control layer. It's a bit of you have to be a kind of lawyer to, yes?
Sorry to interrupt. I'm building up a bit of a backlog of questions around some of the kind of core domain concepts. So OSCAL, I know, has security in the name.
Mm-hmm.
So just focused on this one. Is that significant? You know, a lot of our compliance is not necessarily security related. It might be other policy frameworks that we have to sort of comply with. The other side of this is also the subject, the cloud artifacts that are being deployed. Obviously that's a focus. It's another one where I'm wondering where you see the boundaries of where this could go, both on both sides of that.
Yeah, so OSCAL is definitely, it's born of a security interest. But it's open enough. Well, it's a very complete schema, and that complete schema can be twisted into various use cases. In fact, the whole thing is true of compliance framework, because essentially with compliance framework, what you're doing is you're saying, is this thing true or false regularly, and then graphing it and tracking it. The real difference with what we're doing here from a test framework is that it's centered around these open standards. So other applications can feed into this data and build their own front ends or build their own control tools and so on.
So you've maybe found that OSCAL is generic enough, in fact, that it could be used outside the
Yeah. These standards by committee things have their pluses and minuses. One of their pluses is they tend to be quite generic, and they tend to try and please everyone. So they're open. The downside is that it can make it slower to implement. So I'm impatient. I would just create a PostgreSDB and make my own schema. But the problem with that is that when we bring other people on board, they'll be like, we don't like your schema. And then you'll get problems. So we like the idea of having that external authority being in charge of that. Let's have a look at the graph. Yeah, okay, so you can see now the graph shows that the findings have gone to 0. So as a compliance manager, I can quickly see, oh, the red is too high, or the red is too low. And then let's say I want to find out which is the problem, then you simply have a look at the findings, and you can see it's uncompliant 1, where's that machine, who owns that machine, and so on. Okay. Let's have a look at the other plan. So I'm going to look at the SSH assessment plan. Postgres security. Let's call it. Okay. So, ooh, is that right? Oh, I didn't pick the right plan. Hang on. Pick plan. SSH PG sec. Okay, that's better. Okay, so this time we've got 1 observation and 0 findings. So I'm watching this as the compliance officer, and everything looks fine. And then I'm on my server at home here, and just going to log in as Postgres. So I'm now doing bad things as the Postgres user. And in a minute, it'll catch up, and we'll see the update. What else can I show you? Oh yeah, while we're doing that, let's have a look at Mongo. So I'll show you the Mongo DB that's storing all this. So if we go to the CF, db.plan.find. This is what's stored in the database around all the different findings and observations that we've got. So you've got the data stored here, which we extract and query for our graphs and so on. What about the plugins?
And is this the OSCAL schema that gets based off of OSCAL
Yeah,
schema?
yeah. So we followed the OSCAL schema where possible. Yeah. We've actually found some problems with the OSCAL schema and just talked to the owner, and she was like, oh yeah, that's a limitation, we're changing that in the next version. So the fact that we're actually implementing it, I think is quite helpful to that project as well. And again, I'll talk a bit more about that when we get near the end. Okay, so we are near the end. So let's have a look at the graph. Yep, so it's recovered. Oh no, I've just broken it, that's right. I've logged on as Postgres. Now if I get out in a minute or so, it'll come back. Yeah, let's go back to the demo, the talk. So, what do we need? What we really need is two things. One is real-world use cases. So we're talking to 2 banks about this at the moment. We've got an NDA with one, and we're talking about plugging this in to reduce the toil that we talked about. Another bank has a compliance manager who wants to just streamline or reduce the number of compliance officers that he needs. So those are the 2 kind of use cases we have at the moment. When we get to implement, we'll see how the schema reacts, and it'll give us a real focus for the development, because at the moment we're developing in a bit of a vacuum. We could really use help from people who know about OSCAL, people who know about cloud control standard project, and of course compliance professionals as well. And then on the engineering side, we really need help, obviously, with the front end, potentially to write generic plugins for it. So generic plugins for the cloud providers that we can just open source and build up that tooling. In fact, if you think of it like Terraform, so Terraform is this sort of engine, and then you have these providers that you use, AWS, Azure. That's the kind of model we're thinking of here, or that we're implementing here. So we want it to be people to contribute. We need help with just developing the back end as well, of course. There's more stuff to do. And security. At the moment, there's no security baked into this open source project, so passwords are just thrown into environment variables and then submitted through REST requests. So anyway, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's compliance framework. Yeah, questions?
May I ask one more question? Like, you talked about plugins and extension points on the subject side, what's being analysed. What about on the compliance side? Is that kind of part of this? Is maybe that suite of extensions grows to cover things like SOX or other regulatory frameworks?
Yeah, so OSCAL has the capability to harbour these things. So you could have like a standard suite of abstract, control standards, collections of controls that you can then just plug into this, and then your assessment plan, which is the sort of the implementation of checking for those controls, can be sort of tailored to your particular case.
Is that a presence in FINOS right now, this project?
No, we've not. I mean, I've been talking to lots of people within FINOS, but it's not a FINOS project. Ultimately, I think it will, in my ideal scenario, will eventually be owned by FINOS, just like Red Hat owned the Java Operator SDK. But I'm I like to implement, get on with an implementation and then present the solution, than go through the process of committees. Sorry, that chap had his hand up first.
I quite like the idea of extensible kind of framework to actually do all these reporting using standards. But it seems like it is only like generating the inputs for officer of compliance department to work on. Ultimately, we want to also close the loop by enforcing some of these, right?
Yeah.
So are you planning to also extend this framework to allow enforcement like nobody should actually be logging in?
So yeah, this is not a reactive control or a preventative control system. So the cloud providers actually do a really good job of that. This is much more about the next layer. It is generally focused more at the compliance level. Now you could plug into the event bus and say, oh, there's a finding, let's go and shut down that VM. That's easily written. And whether we build that will depend on the use cases we get. So we want to be driven by user need. So if the user comes to us and says, this is what we want, then we probably will build that. But it will be a separate component within the compliance framework project. So at the moment, there's like 6 or 7 different code bases within compliance framework, which are all discrete.
I have that question because it seems like very similar to what policy as code.
Yeah.
And if you look at how people adopt that in, let's say, cognitive work, they actually do this OPA kind of syntax, not only just for checking, but also plugging it into like a emission hook to reject anything that is failed in the standard. Right? So
Yeah, so if you're really advanced in this already, then you won't need this, because you'll be preventing everything that shouldn't happen, and that's the ideal.
I'm just thinking one of there is a hope that you can actually say, because we are reactive, we are already too late, there are some bad boys in the production farm. So you use these tools to highlight who are the bad boys first, and then you start slowly enforcing.
Yeah, I mean, that could be one pattern you follow. Yeah, we can talk more about it afterwards, I think. Yeah.
Can I just say something on your side? So when it comes to vulnerability and there are always two types. So one that does get introduced through a CI/CD pipeline, like I'm introducing a new dependency, and that is a problem, which to your point should be stored as a way in the pipeline. But look at log4j. Nobody changed anything. It just got it there. And this is something that will also be able, and that's where the compliance comes in, because there's real-time compliance and clean-time compliance. Because we constantly need to check if something, even without us doing it. So the question I had, and the gentleman here mentioned software, right? Without mentioning when it works, so we do software for everything that's edible in the cloud. Now, even if the cloud provider says we are soft compliant, because we have the wrapper on it, we have to do a separate check of review. What we realize is that depends a lot on the implementation. Then go as a compliance manager to check. So everything is, to your point, on a spreadsheet. There are screenshots of things, like you mentioned, because it depends on implementation. For a plugin to work, it has to be very uniform.
Yeah.
So my question is more towards, do you truly see this becoming open source? Because a plugin that I would write, I think it's going to become very specific, not something that somebody can pick up and run it against their Aurora Postgres module to check if it has retention policy.
Yes, so there's going to be two, probably a bit like Terraform might be in some organizations. There's going to be two channels. There's going to be a public channel and a private one. So when we talk to compliance officers, they're talking about, we've got 20,000 VMs running in a data center. We just want to go around all of them and check that they've got the particular process running. So they'd want us, they'd pay us as consultants to write the plugins for them to do that. So that's one model we have of making money out of this. But really the traction will come from the public stuff. So the Azure tag one, we could just publish that and then everyone could use it. So there'll be two classes, if you like. And so the trick for us is making this a public thing that we're associated with, and then we talk to you and you say, hey, great, we can write you some plugins for that. But we keep it private.
I think back from you guys, some of the areas that you mentioned, it's good that obviously you're trying to do shift left and automate sort of the areas where you can automatically check and stuff. But what about the feedback loop? I think at UBS we see a challenge where, yes, we have a lot of vendor applications, automatically scanning the containers, but at the end of the day, email gets fired to some software component manager saying, you're not good compliant, can you please go and check and validate? And that sort of all of that goes on out of the overall automation. Yeah? And then you lose that feedback loop later on to say whether that team, crew, pod, where actually how they're sort of be progressing on the feedback loop. You told them on Monday they have a compliance issue. How did they, get that resolved all the time? So are you thinking of like capturing some sort of feedback loop as well to say when it was notified, when it got resolved, and how is that kind of trending overall?
Well, the data will be there to track that information. So if you imagine you've got 1,000 VMs and you've got a pie chart of which Linux version they're running, and 10% of them are out of compliance, you could say like we're resolving 1% a week with this data. But the deeper problem, the organizational problem I think you're also talking about, which is no one actually does the work. We can't solve that problem. But hopefully this would help.
Yeah.
Yes?
I'll talk to you after, because we're building something that might help you with
that. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
It's a similar compliance problem we have to build case management for transaction monitoring. it's just another case, track it,
Yeah,
monitor it, make sure it's being addressed.
yeah. I
We'll
mean,
talk to you afterwards.
it's not a very complicated system.
I like it.
It's just that it's built for this purpose and it's designed for this purpose in future. That's the hook for it. I think we're over time. Thank you very much for your attention. That was really, thank you very much. Please come talk to me if you've got any questions or want to talk more.